Ladies and gents, it's my privilege to welcome our next presenter, Captain Paul Mogash, CSC, Royal Australian Navy. Captain Mogash completed helicopter training and was posted to 817 Squadron in September 1992 to fly the Sea King anti-submarine warfare helicopter. Captain Mogash has served in various appointments from squadron pilot, training officer, flight commander, executive officer to commanding officer. Captain Mogash's operational service includes service in Bougainville, Operation Gold, Operation Trek in Solomon Islands, Bastille, Slipper and Falconer in the Northern Arabian Gulf. Captain Mogash most recently served as Director, Navy Leadership and Culture Development, and now looks forward to leading organisational change across Army as the inaugural Director of Navy Culture. Today, Captain Mogash will share his insights and observations on the culture and the self-correcting nature of Navy throughout his career. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you, and thank you, sir, for the invite to come and present today. I will say right off the bat, my job description is fairly broad, but I am not responsible for changing Army's culture across the organisation. I'm pretty comfortable with just working on Navy at the moment. Interesting to be back here at ADFA for me. I started here in 1986 as a young midshipman, first year of opening, so standing on the place where I can recall the words of my father, who was a Warrant Officer Class 1, Royal Regiment of Australian Artillery, as he called it. And he said, when I got off onto the bus, whatever you do, listen to your senior NCOs. They will know what they're doing, and listen to them. And he reverted to Warrant Officer Class 1 at that point with his finger in my chest. Yes, Dad, go from there. So imagine my surprise when I get down here and our squadron SSM is in fact Warrant Officer Class 2 Winchester artillery as well. Week 1, he's walking past doing one of those inspections you do in those first couple of days. We're in our poorly ironed jungle greens as it was in those days. And we've finally got our name tags on. He stops and looks at my name tag. He takes a step on and then a step back. He looks me up and down again. He goes, "Your father was in the Army, wasn't he?" And I said, "Yes, Warrant Officer." And he said, and he moved on. And it was at that point that I went, oh, maybe there's an experience there that I perhaps should have known about. Fortunately, a week later, he came back and said, on the same inspection, "Your father, not a bad bloke." Moved on. Massive relief. Leadership comes from many forms and many advice. Trust your parents. They do give you good advice when it comes down to it. I'm going to talk today about what we have here, self-correcting organisations. And when it struck me with this topic, it really came about because when I was thinking about it, I thought that this is really about organisational change. And when we think about organisational change and correcting our organisational pathways, we're actually talking about organisational learning, which comes down to about how people learn. So that's what I want to focus on today and reveal some of the research that the Directorate has been doing over the last 4 years to pull together an understanding of how organisations change over time. And then if the right level of leadership is applied at various levels, you can actually understand that change to affect correction for future advancement, for better performance in the long run. The performance actually came out of understanding this thing called normalisation of deviance. We'll talk about it in a bit more detail shortly, but normalisation of deviance came from Diane Vaughan, who studied both the space shuttle accidents and looked at how organisations change. So what we sought to do is, if we could understand what factors actually influence normalisation of deviance, and then if we can identify those factors, how can we influence them? Or at least get in the front of them, so get inside the OODA loop, if you like, and actually make a decision that will change the impact of those factors. From there, and what I'll talk about later on is the so what. What is it for self-learning or self-correcting organisations as we come to it? So back into that initial model and predictive factors, and this is Diane Vaughan's work. Organisations have an acceptable band of conduct. It's not always 100%, but that's acceptable, safe, efficient. That's what we want to aim our organisations in. But over time, small deviations will occur, and if not corrected, not directed, you will see those changes become normalised over time. And that's what we see in that first level. Small behaviours in the group changes. If they become entrenched, if they become normalised, and really by normalisation it means if those junior people are passing those on to the new joiners, then you end up getting a change in group thinking, and in the worst case you get a change in group attitudes and behaviours, which is really what culture is all about. It's about those underlying attitudes and beliefs of an organisation. When those things become set and they are deviant, if you like, away from the standard, you are ripe for increased risk. And that's what it's all about. Doesn't mean things are going to go wrong, but risk becomes an increasing factor. And so our hypothesis was that in the early days, there are factors in the behaviours, in the organisational structure, even in the command setups, that can actually point towards the potential for these deviations to take place. And therefore, if you can identify them, you can counter them as we go through. Part of the design was then to break it down into the different groups. We looked at a number of organisations, which I'll talk about shortly. We broke the groups down for mathematical simplicity into 3 performance groups: the high, the medium, the low. And from there was a massive regression analysis with a bunch of mathematicians in the University of WA, that's the limit of my mathematical knowledge, that came out that supported this breakdown of performance. And we examined things like safety surveys, performance outcomes, organisational cultural inventories and other data, mixing it together to understand how we can band groups of people. From there, what we did was go into 3 case studies and interview about 45 people from across the organisation and their experiences. And we looked at 3 organisational poor outcomes, that being the Seeking accident of April in 2005. Those who don't know, a Seeking helicopter from 817 Squadron crashed at Neas Island. It speared into the ground as a result of mechanical failure and killed 9 of the 11 people on board. HMAS Success we looked at. We looked at the poor organisational or leadership outcomes from an up-top trip, a Southeast Asian deployment in 2009. And we looked at the organisational changes that led to those poor behavioural outcomes. We then looked at the Rizzo Review. In the Rizzo Review, Paul Rizzo, who was tasked by government to examine naval engineering outcomes that led to us, or Navy, being unable to support government's aims back in 2009 as a result of Cyclone Yahtzee. We then thought, well, if we're looking at this negative side, let's look at some positive sides as well. And so we examined the FFG Enterprise. And the FFG Enterprise is a conglomeration overseen by Navy that looks after the support for our frigates. It was rebuilt, redesigned, a big collaborative approach was taken with an aim of constructive outcomes, and it produced incredible outcomes with ahead of schedule delivery, under budget, with a much better survival rate of the systems once they re-entered service. We looked at fatigue trial and HMAS Warramunga and the difference that made for both people. And we also looked at the crew change activities in a ship swap between 2 ships. So one crew moving from one ship to another as the ship was rolling into maintenance, and the leadership activities involved there. The outcome of that was that we were able to then look at what are we going to provide for this. It's red flags and blue flags. Red flags, those things, critical indicators that will point to conducive or decline of behavioural standards. Those things we don't want to happen. But we also noticed that there were positive things, the constructive case, the things we want to encourage. So the actions taken that are known to improve those behaviours and culture, and they're all, not surprisingly, people-focused. They're all around the people, the interaction space, that connection with others inside a team and inside, therefore, a system. And the system, generally for us, is a ship at sea. This comes to this slide here, and this is from Chris Argyris, who produced it way back in 1976. This is about learning. And we use this because we considered that where organisations were failing, they were going wrong, they're resorting down to the single loop learning principle. Now, single loop learning comes from an organisational functions required, you come to a decision point, an outcome is achieved, feedback is taken from that outcome, and you go straight back to alter your decision and go through with it. But what you're not looking at in a single loop learning is to go back in and examine the premise for the decision in the first place. What is the operating context? What are the rules of engagement? What are the considerations that we make? Double loop learning takes effort and it takes time, but it's that place where once you get a feedback from a decision or an output, you then not only look at the decision you've made, but you consider it in light of that context that was originally set. What is actually the mental model we're doing? Did the cultural assumptions that within our organisation drive us to a point that perhaps was not right? Do we need to change our decision-making rules in this place? Do we need to change the decision makers? Do we need to alter risk approach? And then from that new outcome, reassess where a decision point needs to be made and then go back into the process from there. We offered that for Navy, when the systems were failing, the organisations were slipping into single loop learning. They were going completely tactical, solving today's problem only, and not looking back at the deeper underlying elements that drove the original decision-making process. To examine this and actually take it to the next level, what we did was pick one of those 3 case studies in decline, and that was the Seeking accident, the crash in 2005 of Shark 02. Importantly, it's not just a crash of an aircraft, it was the death of 9 people who unnecessarily died at our own hands. It was our own people who made these mistakes and created this disaster. But they were part of the system in a single loop learning organisation. The organisation, as we'll see, was not double loop learning and going back and examining it. So, busy slide here, I'll talk you through it. What we did was use the 2005 accident on the right-hand side at the top there. It's a really weak laser, what a bigger laser. The 2005 accident as our starting point. The Board of Inquiry for that accident went back about 4 to 5 years and looked at the deep elements of the organisational failings, how it played across. It was an amazing report. It goes to 3 full volumes. It sits about 8 inches thick. And it examined that organisational outcomes and, importantly, the nature of the organisational accident. It did not point the finger at the last person who had their fingers on the tools. That would be the single loop learning piece. It went way deep. But due to a number of reasons, it really only went back to those key areas that resulted in the causal factors of that accident itself. What we decided to do was go back even further and look organisationally at the Fleet Air Arm and say, what was the previous most significant event that altered the nature of culture in the Fleet Air Arm? And it was the 1982 demise of the fixed-wing air arm. We had an aircraft carrier, we had A4 Skyhawk jets, trackers. When the decision was made by government to not renew that capability, the Fleet Air Arm was closed down. We went from a Fleet Air Arm of 2,000 people down to one of about 800 almost overnight. It was a fundamental shift, not just in the culture of the organisation, but also in how we operated, and particularly in the service that was provided to the fleet. No longer did we have seagoing a platform that could take aviation to sea. So the fundamental premise for our work had to change. What we did then was examine what happened in between 1982 and 2005. And we broke it down into those 3 key areas there in the red, blue and the green. We looked at what operations occurred. And you can see for the first 8 or 9 years, almost nothing. It was pretty quiet time in the ADF. Not a lot of operations happened, and therefore there wasn't a lot of government pull for immediate aviation support at sea. Not a lot happened in the structural change piece until the late 1980s. DNAW there is the Director of Naval Aviation Warfare, and that was closed down in the late 1980s, arguably because, well, we're not doing much warfare, so we don't need an Office of Aviation Warfare. Monumentally short-sighted, as it turned out. We then had, of course, in the green there, the operational outcomes. And principally, there was a limited operational focus. Our helicopters, there were only 3 ships that 2 of them could land on. In the mid-1980s, we introduced the Squirrel helicopter in a training role. We then sent that to sea in our frigates to try and introduce aviation back into the frigate force. But by that stage, we'd had frigates at sea for 6 years. A generation of sailors and officers had been through that training pipeline and had no knowledge of how aviation worked. Therefore, they had no perception of the value of aviation to naval operations. And that continued on to the end of the 1990s. And so you've got 10 years almost when you have 1.5 generations of people coming through with no sense of value being perceived from that capability, but also the people in the Fleet Air Arm who were not sensing their own sense of value and their contribution to Navy. The result of that was, over that period, Navy Aviation had to redevelop its own sense of value and its own sense of purpose. It had to recommit to understanding how it could contribute to naval operations. It changed, of course, in the mid-1990s as part of that redevelopment when we started to see more operations. There was a lot more defence aid to the civil community type work in flooding support and firefighter support. There was Operation Solace in Somalia in 1993, and we had a Sea King go across to that. And suddenly it was perceived that there's elements of the Fleet Arm that could provide an operational service, albeit not in the traditional warfighting role. At this point, we had NASPO established, which was the Naval Aviation System Project Office, centralised in Nowra. It was previously in Sydney, away from the force. That gave a focus to the engineering support. So things started to sense up. There was momentum starting to be gathered. So there was a reintegration and a redevelopment piece. We're now sending aircraft to sea in greater numbers, albeit in a very limited fashion with aircraft such as the Squirrel. By the mid-1990s, what we see is a change of events, particularly at the top of aviation. In 1996, the Black Hawk collision at the High Range Training Area began to shift focus about ADF airworthiness. We also saw an increasing change in the command structure of the Fleet Air Arm, with the commander of the Naval Aviation Group established. And so as these aircraft were beginning to go to sea in greater numbers, people were beginning to see the value. The value exchange was starting to happen. Value is important because it goes to the nature of reputation. Reputation matters for us in uniform, particularly in that level of service that we give. What we then saw in the late 1990s was a growth in that operational delivery. And of course, in 1998, 1999, the Seahawk platform came online and went to sea in 1999, big time, ultimately with operations in the Middle East. The Seahawk had actually been introduced way back in the late 1980s and had gone to sea as part of the first operations in the Middle East, but it had outflown its logistics chain and largely did very little at sea in the first 5 to 6 years of its service life. So it didn't play a big role. But by the late 1990s, we've got Seahawks at sea, we've got Sea Kings at sea in 3 platforms, we've got Squirrel doing work all over the place. There was a value proposition well established. Navy was asking for aviation assets, and the Fleet Air Arm was saying, yes, sir, I will do it, and off they would go. We would make it happen. Therefore, the perception from Fleet was, over the subsequent 5 years, from 1999 until 2004, that if the Fleet asked for an aircraft, it was going to get it. You did not say no. You said, aye, aye, we'll make it work. And ultimately, the Fleet Air Arm fell into the trap of being a valued force, but never wanting to let down that value proposition, never wanting to sort of fall on the poor reputation piece. The outcome, of course, as we know, is that back in, not going to stay there, is it? There it is that increasing operational risk began to emerge. And we know that from the Sea King accident, up to 18 months before that accident, that squadron, 817 Squadron, was having a litany of poor maintenance failures, poor outcomes, sending aircraft at the sea that should never have gone to sea in excess of the statement of operating intent. And ultimately, it came home to roost on the 2nd of April 2005 when we killed 9 of our own people. Massive disaster. So we looked at these 5 phases and went, well, what's in that? Is there anything in the literature? And of course, the first 4 are classic Peter Tuchman, forming, storming, norming, performing. There's nothing new about that. But we had never looked at it in that detail. The organisation hadn't gone back and examined the change in what we were doing over this long period. So what we did was then go, well, what happened post-2005? And we ended up with this slide here. Of course, the dotted line, the vertical dotted line is where we're at now. It's actually more compressed, but what we can see from the post-event changes, the structural changes in the operational outcome, is that the Fleet Air Arm's been busy, along with the rest of the Australian Defence Force. We've rolled out a new aircraft type, 2 new aircraft types, in fact, the MRH-90 and the Seahawk Romeo. We retired the Sea King in 2011, and we changed the role back into operational warfighting with the Romeo. It is no longer a utility cab that can do bits of both. It's a proper warfighting platform. We then had some changes in terms of structural airworthiness with the holistic airworthiness review after the Sea King accident that affected the entire Australian Defence Force. But what we did then after that rebuild period in 2006 to 2009 was become operationally competent again. Therefore, the value proposition was re-established. Therefore, our reputation was being established. People were being rewarded for success, for what they did, what we achieved as an organisation. All at the same time, there's elements of that risk are starting to increase. The good news now is that we are tending to be towards a double loop learning organisation. I briefed this in detail down at the Fleet Air Arm just last Monday, and the things they talked about were in fact not a surprise to them. This was not news because they have been examining elements of this. The key is how do we, as leaders in various levels of the organisation, sit back and go back into our teams and try and do that double loop learning, trying to take that structural approach to what we do as opposed to the tactical, here's my job, here's how I'm going to do it, there's the effect I've achieved. That's the single loop piece. How do we then examine the bigger piece that broadens out? And so I'll wrap up very briefly here, and this is the so what. Enduring organisational correction comes from double loop learning. You must examine the underlying premise, either at the organisational, i.e. the headquarters or structural level, but even at the lower formation level, you can still understand the context. Review it in historical context, or even back through that people endeavour piece. Challenge assumptions. Never accept it. That's a pretty standard thing we're taught from day one as leaders. Challenge the assumptions about it, but actually drive through to the logical conclusions, the so what. We need to find a solution that does not always equate to solving the problem. The solution might not be the problem here. That's a different one to talk about. You might be thinking you've got a problem that's X, when in fact a re-examination of it means the problem is not X. It's actually Y, and your solution is Z. You have to take a subsequent approach. Helping to re-examine helps you change your approach. Normalisation of deviance happens to all of us, and it happens in a very subtle and incremental way. You've got to look for it to make it happen. And if you're not looking for those incremental deviations of performance in the behaviours of your team, they'll become embedded, and ultimately they'll become a change in your culture. And lastly, this is hard work. This takes the moral courage piece. It really is about driving that view of your organisations and about how we examine internally what we do. It's about professional mastery, because we are not just tradespeople who come to work to fly a helicopter or drive a truck or fire a weapon. We're actually part of that profession of arms. You all know that. This is the difference. This kind of thinking, this double loop learning and approach to it is what makes us the profession of arms, because we can challenge the assumptions, we can understand the context, either at a tactical level, a strategic level, or even at a high level governmental level. And the key to that is understanding the history of why you do things in the recent past, in the medium past. In leadership, we've studied history for eons. We do it and we look at individual leaders. We might look at some of their actions. But do we look at the history of organisations? That's the challenge that we're proposing to Navy. That's the challenge that I throw out to you today. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much.